Ah, okay, this is another question pertaining to the runes. If you want the short, straightforward answer, they were nothing mystical or magical. The only ones who applied that are the same sources that were smearing cultures to try and discourage other people from going back into it and then embellishing it into something very twisted, sinister, dark, mystical, mysterious, so as to keep people away from continuously learning it as a form of writing is all. And then around in the 1600s or whatever, they were officially banned as a so-called get rid of the last vestiges of the devil and chase them out of Europe forever. But the fact of the matter is the word ruin is the same as ruin, which also is the evolution of the word rowan, and all tied to the word meaning red. And in the case of rowan, little red is basically as a term for the mountain ash, which also tends to be the preferred wood to carve things out of. The various used for various means, everything from making dyes to kind of a bitter food if properly boiled, things like that. You know, things of that sort. I wouldn't exactly include that in my personal diet, but it's one of those things good to know if you ever get desperate, you're nearby with that and you got nothing else to eat. I've been there before. Yeah. But, yeah, ultimately the real meaning of Ren is associated with red. And so, of course, you got the figure also named Rind, or Rind, which is basically the same thing. His name also means redhead, and is associated with runes and the rowan tree. And another one of the three aspects of the three goddesses associated with Godin, just as he has the triadic form, so do each 23 goddess, like I said earlier. Which again, back on the other videos pertaining specifically to Sidutru, I've clarified that already. So I don't want to waste this video rehashing the same thing. As far as casting the runes down on cloth and reading them, that's because what they were doing is they were taking these staves in a bundle of 13, and they were casting them, spreading them out, and looking at the environment and keeping track of the time. They were just calendars. Rune stones are not things carried around in little pouches and tossed down to kind of get some kind of lot casting thing. It just is not historical. It's modern stuff based in links with concepts like the I Ching and the so-called blank rune, which in itself is an oxymoron, considering the rune is a symbol, so if it's blank, it's not really a symbol. So, you know, it's stuff like that. Even the so-called Futhar in itself isn't even properly translated. And it's like every other word that says, you know, it's either translated as a god, Tier is translated as a god, Ansu is translated as God, but is actually more of the word ancestor and answer. So, you know, it's like, even the one letter P rune that people have tried to just brain dead to show that they don't get it, and somebody was thinking their ball sacks, is the one called Fjord. Fjord is a mountain rip that's mentioned in the Bible, and literally described as a cleft rock. And that's just another example of how false associated words have been slapped onto those things. Lagu is translated supposedly as meaning water or river mouth in those same nonsense things. So we already know that Lagu, Laga, Loga, and everything else means what lays, literally laws. And so that's pretty much easily to throw out, since the word for water hasn't really changed much, even in those ancient times. And there's variations of it in all of our various related languages of European and whatnot, all the way over to the Hittites that spoke it as Wahatar. And among the Saxons, they called it watar, which is where we get the word water from. And that's just an example of people not paying attention, doing any real research, or listening very closely to much of anything, and instead want to fall around a bunch of embellishments rather than focus on the real foundations. Otherwise, the other instances, like I was saying before, are specifically memorial stones, both commemorating a particular event and their, those ancient histories, which were later being decimated and demolished to kind of cut people off from knowledge of their past, to having things built over them, to having the various cathedrals and churches built from those stones after they cut off all the so-called evil heathen things, and more or less did what we would consider a very, very big illegal no-no in our country, of going around into a cemetery, picking over tombstones and turning around and using them as building material for walls or whatnot, or fences and actual walls for a building or something, and then polishing away or carving away the names and dates of a person's life and demise. And that's pretty much what was going on over there at the time. The original barrows themselves served as holy grounds, the holy guard, around the gods or temples or good houses. Just like you would find today in some of your churches with graves around them. This is a very old ancient custom, and it's found almost everywhere. And these were originally open where, for example, you find children buried on they died in birth or whatever, a young age, just from sickness or whatever. On the left, the women would be buried. On the right, the men would be buried straight ahead, kind of like in a cross-one shape. Whereas in later burials, you find that it's only single people being there that would literally be considered elevated ancestors, rulers, heroes, things of that sort, with individual burial mounds that became recognized as that Haligan, or holy ones, or common unsers, or ancestors, and things of that sort. And it was not uncommon to have such memorial stones placed either to the right or the left or on both sides of said burial chambers, which had the Haligates, or it's basically called trilithons, that were built into the front entrance or just outside of it, to basically give the person an understanding that they are now leaving the normal world and entering into the place that's reserved for spirits of the dead and the ancestors and everything else. This is one of the things that's kind of echoed in folklore that's ignored about the stories about parties occurring among the dead in these burrows. And what people don't understand is that if you actually think about that folklore, and in the way the fact that these were constructed to be open that people would go in at certain times of the year before they were looted and whatnot, and desecrated, essentially. The custom was at certain times of the year, especially like in August or whatever, they were traditionally opened up. People would go in there, and they'd set up tables and everything, and essentially have the feast with the living and the dead, where offerings were burnt in central parts nearby or in towards the center of these burial areas, and the other people would actually, the living people would feast, so that they were having essentially a communion meal with their ancestors, maintaining those bonds and maintaining an ongoing reciprocal object that transcended life and death. And so it was very common for people to handle their own burials and their own family members and whatnot in the original customs, though that was also taken over later by the various authorities to discourage honoring of the dead instead of praying for the dead, or Haligan being converted over to the concept of the saint when it wasn't that rigid, which funny enough, most people don't realize is that it didn't even occur until the 10th century that the Catholic Church started trying to essentially dominate that aspect of culture in Europe. Previously, the whole concept of saints was not part of Catholicism prior to the 10th century. And they didn't actually canonize anyone, because the general view in Christianity is that you're a member of Christianity, you're already considered that, and therefore, why canonize you? Who's praying to who? Even though the so-called Virgin Mary thing was originally considered heretical when it first came out, it later got absorbed and identified into the main Catholic movement of things. And it's also well known that some of the ancestral figures were turned into saints, like Miranda the Blessed and Bridget and whatnot, mixed with an actual historical figure and an ancestor run to create a hybrid. Sort of like taking the Coca-Cola version of Santa and mixing it with the actual character of St. Nicholas. Again, Catholic and then parody, essentially, in that particular case. It doesn't mean that the Santa in origin never existed. It just means that the Coca-Cola version of the red jolly suit and all that stuff didn't exist until a marketing deal at best. It went from the stern-looking whatever character that was later absorbed. That was mixed with all kinds of other things, which it didn't actually have as much to do with the actual St. Nicholas from Catholicism as people have you believe. So that's just a lot of examples how Sidutru is significantly different. Because it really is. And that's why a lot with regard Sidutru is essentially a renegade from all these different movements out there. And there's a lot more people who have been honest about it and said, they've left that identity and they more or less go about it on their own because they've come across the same kind of BS. I myself, instead of just kind of folding up shop and calling a bucket, say BS, instead, in the last 20 years or so, I dug deep. I explored it. I was trying to understand the symbols, the writing, the associations, the connections, the things like that. Even the word Velknut, supposedly the knot of the slain. Again, we go back to the word Val, which means to choose, and then the word Nut, which means not. So, chosen knot? No, I don't think so. But they try to say that because of its image having appeared on sculpture. It represents the three goddesses' bottom line and their interconnected holy quality and so on. And that's why it's often three triangles interlocked to represent all three of them. Or you might find the one that's similar to the Christian Trinity knot, which actually comes from that source. In a stylized form, and you'll actually see three of these on the same face of the same stone. It represents each one of the three goddesses in their triangle form symbolically, because the supreme God and these three great goddesses were not themselves actually represented, but the lesser forms could be as metaphorical symbols. And that's also something that's been very well noted, but often ignored. So you got like three horns spiraling from a single central point that represents one god, three projected aspects. That's why they're not actually separate in one of the earlier forms. Whereas you have what I like to refer to as the Norner knot, to be more accurate, or the weird knot, as representing three goddesses by those actual symbols, which, again, paying attention to all the details, that lines up far more sensibly, and it makes a hell of a lot more sense. It's just that simple.